Queen Elizabeth I did not merely defeat her would-be assassin, she had him torn apart alive. Anthony Babington did not just die for plotting against England's virgin queen. He was cut open while still breathing, his body butchered piece by piece as the crowd watched in horror. At only 24 years old, rich, handsome, and born into privilege, he ended his life screaming on the scaffold in one of the most savage executions in English history. This was not justice. It was annihilation. Babington believed he was saving a queen. He thought he was the chosen hero in a sacred mission to rescue Mary, Queen of Scots, and strike down the Elizabeth. But Elizabeth I's intelligence network had already marked him. Every letter, every whisper, every dream he had was being watched, guided, and manipulated by the crown's deadliest spies. He imagined himself a romantic revolutionary. In reality, he was a naive boy, walking straight into a government trap, a pawn fed with fantasies until he signed his own death warrant. He thought he was writing history. He was only writing his execution order. And Elizabeth I made sure he paid for that fantasy with his still-beating heart. England in the 1580s was a place of constant fear where Queen Elizabeth I held a fragile grip on power. She faced immense hostility from Catholic nations like Spain and France, who viewed her as an illegitimate ruler. Her government remained on high alert, knowing that foreign invaders or secret traitors within the country were waiting for a chance to strike. The true source of this danger came from inside England itself, Mary Stuart. For 20 years, this Catholic queen lived in captivity, serving as a beacon for every enemy of the state. As long as Mary lived, she remained a weapon for those wishing to destroy the Protestant regime and seize the crown. Elizabeth's advisors knew that Mary had to die, but they could not execute royalty without just cause. They needed undeniable proof of treason to justify such a drastic act, so they devised a lethal plan. They needed a naive pawn to lure Mary into implicating herself, and in the countryside, they found their perfect fool. Anthony Babington was born in October 1561 at Dethick Manor in Derbyshire. He didn't just win the genetic lottery, he won the jackpot. He was the eldest son of Sir Henry Babington, a crucial member of the landed gentry. Tragedy struck early, but in a way that would warp Anthony's character forever. His father died in 1571 when Anthony was only 9 years old. In an instant, this child became the master of a staggering fortune. We aren't talking about a comfortable inheritance. We are talking about vast estates, productive lead mines, and coal mines. By the standards of the 16th century, he was obscenely wealthy. This wealth is the key to his psychology. Anthony Babington grew up in a world where he was never told no. He was the little lord, the master of all he surveyed. His money insulated him from the harsh realities of life. It allowed him to indulge in fine clothes, expensive hobbies, and eventually dangerous fantasies. But beneath the surface of this privileged existence lay a dangerous secret. The Babingtons were publicly Protestant, but privately, passionately Catholic. After his father's death, his mother remarried Henry Fotheringhay, a man of fierce Catholic devotion. Dethick Manor became a safe house for the Catholic underground. The young boy would have watched strangers arriving in the dead of night, men with soft hands and intense eyes hiding beneath rough cloaks. He would have seen the priest holes, secret chambers built behind false walls and under floorboards, where these holy men would hide when the government's priest hunters came banging on the door. He grew up absorbing a narrative of martyrdom. He learned that the government was evil, that the true faith was under siege, and that true nobility lay in defiance. The moment that sealed Babington's fate happened during his teenage years. As was the custom for young noblemen, he was sent away to serve as a page in a great aristocratic household, to learn manners, politics, and the art of being a gentleman. In a twist of fate that seems almost scripted, he was sent to the household of the Earl of Shrewsbury. Why does this matter? Because the Earl of Shrewsbury was the man tasked with being the jailer of Mary, Queen of Scots. At Sheffield Castle, the impressionable teenage boy observed the legend from the shadows. Mary was in her 30s then, charismatic, intelligent, and possessing a tragic aura. He likely never held a conversation with her, yet he became obsessed. She wasn't a complex geopolitical problem to him. She was a damsel in distress straight out of the Arthurian legends he loved to read. It wasn't a romance based on reality. It was a fanatical, distant worship. He decided then and there that he would be her knight. He would be the Lancelot to her Guinevere. By 1580, Anthony was 19. He embarked on the Grand Tour of Europe, a rite of passage for wealthy Englishmen. But while others went to admire Roman ruins or Venetian art, Anthony headed straight for the hornet's nest, Paris. Paris was the headquarters of the English Catholic exile community. It was a city filled with bitter, dangerous men, aristocrats who had lost their lands, priests who had fled the gallows, and spies who sold secrets for bread. For a wealthy, impressionable young man eager to make a name for himself, it was the worst possible environment. He met Thomas Morgan, Mary Stuart's chief agent in exile. These hardened operatives saw Anthony coming a mile away. They saw the velvet clothes, the heavy purse, and the starry-eyed look in his eyes. They flattered him. They told him he was the future of the Catholic cause. They convinced him to become a courier, carrying secret letters back and forth to Mary upon his return to England. Babington drank it up. He felt important. He felt like a player in the great game of Europe. Contemporaries describe Babington during this period with a phrase that rings true across the centuries. He was a man of more money than sense. Upon his return to London, Babington's behavior moved from dangerous to suicidal. He began to gather a group of like-minded young men, wealthy, Catholic, and bored. They met in taverns, drank too much wine, and whispered about the great change that was coming. We can see the extent of Babington's staggering vanity in one specific detail that later came back to haunt him. While he was discussing high treason, plotting the murder of the Queen and a foreign invasion, he commissioned a painting. It was a group portrait of himself surrounded by 6 of his co-conspirators, the very men who would eventually be tasked with the assassination. But that wasn't enough. He had a Latin motto inscribed on the painting, Hae mihi sunt comites, quos ipsa pericula ducunt. Translation, these are my companions, whom danger itself leads. Think about the breathtaking stupidity of this act. He was planning regicide, the highest crime in the land, punishable by the most horrific death imaginable. And he had a commemorative team photo painted, complete with a catchy slogan about how dangerous they were. It was the 16th century equivalent of posting your crime on social media before you commit it. Babington didn't just want to be a conspirator. He wanted to be known as a conspirator. He was playing a role. He thought he was in a story. He didn't realize that in the real world, the villains don't play by the rules of chivalry. While Babington was playing at Revolution in the taverns of London, a far deadlier game was being orchestrated in the shadows of Whitehall Palace. Enter Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master. If Babington was a romantic fool, Walsingham was a machine of cold, hard logic. He was a devout Puritan, dressed always in somber black. He barely slept. He suffered from painful kidney stones that kept him in constant agony, which perhaps only sharpened his ruthless focus. He famously said, "There is less danger in fearing too much than too little." Walsingham knew something was brewing. His network of informants was legendary. He had spies in the French embassy, spies in the ports, and spies in the seminaries. He didn't want to just stop a plot. He wanted to encourage it. He wanted to water the seeds of treason, let them bloom into a full flower, and then cut them down, taking Mary Queen of Scots with them. He needed Mary to sign her own death warrant. He needed her to put ink to paper and authorize the assassination of Elizabeth. To do this, Walsingham deployed a weapon against Babington that the young romantic never saw coming: betrayal by the very people he loved. Walsingham's genius lay in turning people. He found the weak links in the Catholic underground and broke them. His first weapon was a young man named Gilbert Gifford. Gifford was a Catholic exile from a good family who had trained as a priest. But Gifford was no martyr. When he was arrested coming back into England, Walsingham gave him a binary choice: the rack and the hangman's noose, or a paycheck and a life of espionage. Gifford chose life. He became a double agent. His job was to approach the Catholic underground and offer himself as a trustworthy courier to reopen communication with Mary, whose correspondence had recently been completely cut off by her strict new jailer, Amyas Paulet. But the cruelest cut came from another agent of Walsingham's, a man named Robert Poley. Robert Poley was a master manipulator, a genius of social engineering. He infiltrated Babington's inner circle not by force but by charm. He became Babington's shadow. He listened to Babington's dreams, validated his fears, and encouraged his worst instincts. Babington adored Poley. He trusted him implicitly with his life, his fortune, and his secrets. In his letters, Babington referred to Poley with deep brotherly affection as Sweet Robin. It is heartbreaking to read in hindsight. While Babington was pouring his heart out to Sweet Robin about his grand plans for Mary's rescue and Elizabeth's death, Poley was taking mental notes. Every night, Sweet Robin would slip away to report every single word directly to Sir Francis Walsingham. Babington believed he was surrounded by loyal companions led by danger. In reality, he was sitting in a room of mirrors, surrounded by professional liars who were being paid to steer him toward the executioner's block. With the human pieces of the chessboard now in place, the naive knight, the treacherous bishop, and the ruthless spymaster, the game moved from the theoretical to the tangible. Walsingham had successfully surrounded Babington with mirrors, reflecting back only what the young man wanted to see. But surveillance alone was not enough to secure a conviction for regicide. Walsingham needed a mechanism to capture the treason in transit. He needed a pipeline that looked so secure, so ingenious, that even a paranoid queen in exile would trust it with her life. As the summer of 1586 approached, the stage shifted from the whispered conversations of London back alleys to the quiet, dusty roads of Staffordshire, where a simple delivery of ale was about to become the deadliest weapon in the English arsenal. To understand the mechanics of the catastrophe, we must look at Mary Queen of Scots' living conditions. She was being held at Chartley Manor in Staffordshire. Her jailer, Sir Amyas Paulet, was a rigid Puritan who hated Mary and everything she stood for. He had locked Chartley down tight, no letters in, no letters out. He had even banned the laundry women from talking to the Queen, fearful they might smuggle notes in their dirty linen. Mary was suffocating. For a political animal like her, being cut off from the world was a form of death. She was desperate for a lifeline. Enter the double agent, Gilbert Gifford. Working for Walsingham, Gifford approached the French embassy and proposed a foolproof way to smuggle letters into Chartley. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity. Chartley Manor, like all great houses, consumed vast quantities of beer. A local brewer in the nearby town of Burton supplied the household weekly. Gifford, acting the part of the devoted Catholic, bribed the brewer. Here is how the beer cask cipher worked. Mary or her secretaries would write a letter in code. They would roll the paper tightly into a tiny cylinder. They would wrap it in leather or waterproof silk. This packet was slipped inside the hollow wooden bung of a beer barrel. When the full barrels were delivered to Chartley, Mary's butler, who was in on the scheme, would pry out the bung, retrieve the letter, and pass it to the Queen. When the empty barrels were sent back to the brewer, Mary's replies would be hidden in the bungs of the empties. To Mary and Babington it seemed like a miracle. The channel was open, they could speak again. But there was a catch. The honest brewer didn't send the letters to their destination. The moment the barrels left Chartley, the letters were extracted and handed to a waiting horseman. This rider galloped not to Babington, but to the residence of Sir Francis Walsingham. In Walsingham's office sat a man named Thomas Philippes. If Walsingham was the architect of the trap, Philippes was the mechanic who kept the gears oiled. Philippes was a small, unassuming man with pockmarked skin and bad eyesight, but he possessed one of the most brilliant mathematical minds in Europe. He was a cryptographer and a master forger. He could crack a cipher in hours, and he could replicate a person's handwriting so perfectly that even their own mother couldn't tell the difference. Every single letter Mary wrote, and every single letter Babington wrote, went across Philippes' desk. He would open the seal using a heated knife to keep the wax intact. He would decipher the code using frequency analysis. He would make a clean copy for Walsingham. Then he would reseal the original letter so it looked untouched and send it back into the pipeline. The conspirators were having a private conversation on a secure line, unaware that the Director of National Security was listening on the extension. There's a chilling detail that survives in the British National Archives to this day. On the back of one of the intercepted letters, Philippes, bored perhaps or grimly amused by the treason he was reading, drew a small doodle. It wasn't a flower or a geometric shape, it was a sketch of a gallows, a hanging tree. Philippes knew exactly where this correspondence was leading. He was literally drawing the future of the men he was tracking. The trap was primed. Now Walsingham needed the smoking gun. He needed Babington to explicitly detail the assassination plot in writing, and he needed Mary to explicitly agree to it. On July 6, 1586, Anthony Babington sat down and wrote the letter that would end his life. Emboldened by the silence, feeling secure in his beer barrel channel and urged on by his treacherous friend Robert Poley, he poured his entire plan onto the page. It was a long, rambling, arrogant letter. In it, he outlined the grand plan. Foreign armies would land to support the uprising. He and his men would storm Chartley and liberate Mary. And then, the most critical point. Babington wrote that 6 noble gentlemen would undertake the tragical execution of Queen Elizabeth. He didn't use the word murder. He used tragical execution. It was a euphemism, a way to dress up a gritty political assassination as a noble act of statecraft. But the law was clear. Plotting the death of the monarch was high treason. Babington sealed the letter. He sent it off. Walsingham intercepted it. Philippes decoded it. When Walsingham read the phrase tragical execution, he must have felt a cold thrill of victory. He had Babington. The boy was dead rights. But Walsingham didn't arrest him, not yet. He held his breath. He needed the big fish. He needed Mary to reply. If Mary ignored the letter, or if she said, "Rescue me, but do not touch my cousin Elizabeth," she might escape the net. The letter was resealed and sent to Chartley. Mary received the letter on July 12th. She was elated. Here was a concrete plan, backed by wealthy noblemen and foreign promises. She spent days drafting her reply with her 2 secretaries, Now and Curl. On July 17th, The response was ready. It was a masterpiece of detail. She gave Babington strategic advice on how to rally the local gentry, how to secure the ports, and how to coordinate with the Spanish. And then she addressed the 6 gentlemen. She did not recoil. She did not forbid it. Instead, she wrote a sentence that would echo through history and eventually echo in the hall of Fotheringhay Castle on the day of her execution. Set the 6 gentlemen to work. There it was, the assent. She had authorized the hit. She had agreed to the murder of a fellow sovereign. When Felipe's decoded this letter in London, he drew a distinct mark on the page. This was the bloody letter. This was the evidence that would finally allow Elizabeth to execute her rival. But Walsingham, ever the perfectionist, wanted one last thing. He had Mary, and he had Babington, but he didn't have the identities of the 6 assassins. Babington had mentioned 6 noble gentlemen, but he hadn't named them. Walsingham wanted to roll up the entire network. He wanted to know exactly who was sharpening their knives. So, he ordered Felipe's to perform one final audacious act of forgery. Felipe's took Mary's letter. He didn't just decode it, he added to it. Mimicking Mary's handwriting with terrifying precision, he added a postscript to the bottom of the letter. The forged note read, in essence, "I would be glad to know the names and qualities of the 6 gentlemen, which are to accomplish the designment. For that it may be, I shall be able, upon knowledge of the parties, to give you some further advice necessary to be followed therein." It was a trap within a trap. The Queen was asking for the names of her heroes so she could thank them and advise them. Babington received the letter. He saw Mary's approval. He saw the request for names. He was ecstatic. His Queen had blessed his crusade. He sat down to write the list of names, the names of his closest friends, the men from the painting. He never suspected that the request came not from his beloved Mary, but from the man who was about to destroy him. By early August 1586, the net was closing. Walsingham had the letters, the codes, the confession, and the names. It was time to harvest the crop. On the evening of August 4th, the end began in a moment of pure cinematic drama. Anthony Babington was dining at a London tavern, often identified as the Rose or the Golden Lion. The atmosphere was jovial. He was dining with his best friend, Robert Poley. Also present were several rough-looking men who Babington didn't know well, but whom Poley had introduced as potential allies. In reality, they were Walsingham's catchpoles, bounty hunters and agents waiting for the signal to make the arrest. Midway through the meal, a messenger arrived. He handed a note to one of Walsingham's men at the table. Babington, perhaps sensing a shift in the air, or perhaps noticing the way the men exchanged glances, managed to lean over and glimpse the note. The contents are disputed by history, but the effect was immediate. It was an order for arrest. The illusion shattered. Babington realized in a sick rush of adrenaline that the men eating his food and drinking his wine were his jailers. He had to act, but he couldn't fight them all. He stood up, forcing a casual smile. He told Poley he needed to pay the bill at the bar, or perhaps use the privy. To sell the lie, he left his expensive velvet cloak and his sword on the bench. No gentleman would leave a tavern without his sword, unless he was coming right back. It was a desperate bluff. Babington walked calmly toward the back of the tavern, and then he bolted. He slipped out a back exit into the darkening London streets. He ran. He didn't go home. He knew Dethick would be surrounded. He didn't go to his lodgings. Panic, cold and hard, took the wheel. The wealthy nobleman who had dreamed of leading armies was now a fugitive with nothing but the clothes on his back. He fled north toward St. John's Wood, which was then a wild forest outside the city limits. Babington met up with a few of his co-conspirators, who had also been tipped off or spooked. They were Barnwell, Charnock, and Gage. Now began the most pathetic chapter of the story. These were men of silk and velvet. They had no survival skills. They were hiding in the woods of St. John's Wood, terrified and starving. In a desperate attempt to disguise themselves, they cut their long, fashionable hair raggedly short with knives. They found walnut shells on the forest floor and used the juice to stain their faces and hands brown, trying to pass themselves off as simple farm laborers. It was a ludicrous disguise. Their clothes, though dirty, were of fine cut. Their accents were upper class. Their hands were soft. They looked exactly what they were, aristocrats playing dress-up. For 10 days they lived like animals. They slept in ditches and barns. They were constantly cold, hungry, and terrified. The manhunt was enormous. Walsingham had released descriptions of them to every town and village. The hue and cry was raised. To the people of England, these men weren't romantic rebels. They were terrorists planning to kill the beloved good Queen Bess and bring back the fires of the Inquisition. On August 14th, driven by starvation, they sought refuge at the house of the Bellamy family in Harrow. The Bellamys were Catholic sympathizers, but it was too late. The neighbors were watching. The roads were blocked. On August 15th, the authorities kicked down the door. Babington and his friends were found hiding in the haylofts and outbuildings. The game was over. When the news broke that the wicked traitors had been captured, London erupted. It wasn't just relief, it was hysteria. Church bells rang out across the city in a deafening peal. Bonfires were lit on every street corner. People danced in the streets singing psalms and drinking to the Queen's health. Babington was dragged back to London in chains. As he was paraded through the city, the cheers of the crowd rang in his ears, but they were cheering for his death. He saw the bonfires and perhaps realized with a shudder that they were a rehearsal for his own execution. He was thrown into the Tower of London. The interrogation began immediately. There was no need for the rack. The evidence was overwhelming. Walsingham had the letters. He had the ciphers. He had the postscript. Babington crumbled. He confessed everything. He tried to blame Poley, tried to blame the priests, tried to blame anyone but himself. But it was useless. He wrote a final letter to Queen Elizabeth begging for mercy. He offered her thousands of pounds for his life. He offered to spy for her. He offered anything. But Elizabeth was not interested in his money. She wanted an example. She wanted a spectacle of terror that would deter any Catholic in England from ever thinking about treason again. The trial was a formality. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty of high treason. The sentence was pronounced to be drawn, hanged, and quartered. Babington was returned to his cell to await the appointed day, September 20th, 1586. He had 1 week left to make peace with the God he thought he was serving. As the heavy door of the Tower of London slammed shut, the frantic energy of the manhunt evaporated, replaced by the suffocating silence of death row. For 7 days, Anthony Babington sat in the damp dark, stripped of his silks, his friends, and his delusions. The realization of his colossal failure must have been a torture far worse than the rack. But outside the stone walls, the city was not silent. It was holding its breath, winding itself tight like a clock spring. The government was preparing a spectacle intended to sear the memory of treason out of the English consciousness forever. The legal paperwork was done. Now the theater of blood was about to open its curtains, and the golden youth was forced to step onto the stage for his final gruesome performance. The dawn of September 20th, 1586, broke over a London that was vibrating with a dark electric energy. The city had not slept. The bonfires that had been lit to celebrate the capture of the traitors were now smoldering heaps of ash, but the heat remained. Thousands of people were moving through the streets. A great tide of humanity pushing toward the fields outside the city walls. They were fathers lifting children onto their shoulders, merchants closing their shops, and apprentices skipping work. They were all heading to the same place, St. Giles in the fields. The location was chosen with grim irony. St. Giles was not the usual place for executions, that was Tyburn. But the government wanted to make a specific point. St. Giles was where Anthony Babington and his friends had often met. It was where they had drunk wine, laughed, and whispered their treason. Now the government would turn their playground into their graveyard. For Anthony Babington, the morning did not bring the sun. It brought the heavy sound of keys in the lock of his cell in the Tower of London. He was brought out into the yard, blinking in the light. He was no longer the peacock in velvet. He was pale, unshaven, and trembling. Alongside him were the first 6 of his co-conspirators, including the priest John Ballard and the savage. They were not allowed to walk to their deaths with dignity. They were to be dragged. The method of transport for a traitor was the hurdle. This was a flat wooden sled or a wicker panel, hitched to the back of a horse. Babington was strapped down onto the wood. As the horses surged forward, dragging the sleds over the cobblestones, the nightmare began. The journey from the tower to St. Giles was long. The streets were lined with screaming crowds. They didn't just watch. They participated. They threw mud, filth, and stones at the men strapped to the sleds. They spat on them. They screamed for their blood. Babington, who had once preened for the admiration of the public, now lay on his back, staring up at a sky blocked by the faces of a mob that hated him. By the time the procession arrived at St. Giles, the men were bruised, covered in filth, and spiritually broken. A massive scaffold had been erected. It was built high, a stage for a morality play. On the platform stood the gallows, a heavy beam with ropes dangling. Beside the gallows burned a large hot fire. Near the fire stood a cauldron of boiling water and a butcher's block. The instruments of drawing and quartering were laid out like surgeons' tools. The message was clear. Death would not be the end of the punishment. It would merely be the middle. The execution began with John Ballard, the priest who had incited the plot. The government wanted to emphasize the religious nature of the treason. Babington was forced to watch. This was part of his psychological torture. He had to witness exactly what was about to happen to him. Ballard was climbed up the ladder. The rope was placed around his neck. He was turned off the ladder. He swung, kicking and choking, but he was not left to die. The executioner, following strict orders to maximize the suffering, cut the rope while Ballard was still alive. The priest dropped to the wooden deck with a heavy thud, gasping for air. He was dazed but conscious. The executioner then stripped him and began the drawing. Babington watched as the knife went in. He watched the castration. He watched the disemboweling. He watched the priest's limbs being hacked apart. Then a voice called out, "Anthony Babington." It was his turn. Babington climbed the ladder. He was 24 years old. He had been the richest young man in Derbyshire. He had been Sweet Anthony. Now he was just meat for the state. On the scaffold, he tried to regain a shred of his old composure. He reportedly admitted his treason, but denied he had sought the Queen's death out of malice, claiming he had been driven by religious zeal. It was a distinction that mattered to no one but him. The executioner placed the noose around his neck. The crowd held its breath. Babington was pushed. He fell. The rope snapped tight. The agony of strangulation began, the panic, the burning lungs, the bulging eyes. But just as the darkness began to close in, just as peace was about to come, the rope was cut. He hit the floor of the scaffold alive. He was fully conscious. His senses were likely heightened by the massive rush of adrenaline. He could smell the smoke of the fire. He could see the blood of John Ballard on the wood planks. The executioner descended upon him. Babington was stripped of his clothes. He lay naked before the multitude. The brutality that followed is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend, but it must be told to understand the era. The executioner took his knife and castrated Babington. Then he sliced open the young man's abdomen from the chest to the groin. Historical accounts from eyewitnesses state that Babington was still awake and aware during this process. He was strong, young, and healthy, which was a curse. His heart refused to give out. As his own bowels were pulled from his body and thrown onto the fire before his eyes, Babington reportedly cried out. He did not cry for Mary. He did not cry for the invasion fleet. He cried out in Latin, Parce mihi, Domine Jesu, spare me, Lord Jesus. Finally, the executioner reached into the chest cavity, located the beating heart, and cut it out. He held it up to the crowd, shouting, Behold the heart of a traitor. Only then did Anthony Babington cease to exist. His body was then hacked into 4 quarters. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it, destined to be spiked on London Bridge as a warning to others. The execution continued. Savage, Barnwell, Tichborne, Tilney, and Abington followed. All were subjected to the same horrific protocol, hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled, and quartered. But as the hours wore on and the blood flowed across the scaffold, the mood of the crowd began to shift. The Elizabethan public was hardened to violence. They were used to bear baiting and public whippings. But this was different. This was a slaughterhouse. The sheer prolonged cruelty of cutting down young men who were still fully conscious and butchering them like cattle began to turn the stomachs of the spectators. The cheers died down. A heavy, sullen silence fell over St. Giles. The people had wanted justice, but they felt they were witnessing sadism. News of the crowd's reaction reached Queen Elizabeth that evening. She was told that the people were horrified by the butchery. Elizabeth, ever the astute politician, knew that pity is the first step toward rebellion. She could not afford to let these traitors die as martyrs. On September 21st, the remaining 7 conspirators were brought out to die, but this time the Queen commanded mercy. They were to be hanged until they were dead, dead, dead. Only after they were lifeless corpses was the drawing and quartering to be performed. Babington and his first group had absorbed the full wrath of the state so that the others might have a quicker end. With the blood washed from the scaffold at St. Giles, a strange silence fell over the government. The Babington plot was officially crushed. Anthony Babington had wanted fame, and he achieved it as the most famous traitor of his generation, the man who painted his own target. But for Sir Francis Walsingham, the bloody spectacle in the fields was merely a prologue. He closed the file marked Babington and opened the file marked Stuart. The useful idiot had served his purpose perfectly. Babington's confession and the fatal letter had provided the legal bullet needed to kill a queen. In late September 1586, shortly after Babington's execution, Mary was moved. She was taken from Chartley Manor and transported to Fotheringhay Castle. The choice of location was psychological warfare. Fotheringhay was not a comfortable house arrest. It was a fortress of the crown, grim and marshy. It was a place where kings and princes went to be forgotten. When Mary arrived, she saw the writing on the wall, quite literally. As she was escorted to her chamber, she passed the castle's crest. Fotheringhay had been a Yorkist stronghold during the Wars of the Roses. It was a place of old blood and bad memories. Mary was isolated. Her papers were seized. Her 2 secretaries, now in Curl, had been arrested and dragged to London, where they were terrified into confirming that the handwriting on the Babington letters was indeed hers. She was stripped of her status. The canopy of state, the symbol of her queenship that hung over her chair, was torn down by her jailer, Amyas Paulet. She was no longer treated as a queen. She was treated as Mary Stuart, the prisoner. On October 11th, 1586, the commissioners arrived at Fotheringhay. It was a formidable army of law and power, 36 peers of the realm, privy councillors, and judges. The most powerful men in England had ridden north to crush one sick, middle-aged woman, but they faced a massive legal problem. Mary refused to attend the trial. Her argument was simple, brilliant, and legally sound. I am a queen. I am not a subject of Elizabeth. I am an absolute sovereign. You have no jurisdiction over me. She was right. In the 16th century, monarchs were appointed by God. One queen could not judge another. To try her as a criminal was to break the great chain of being. For 2 days, a tense standoff ensued. Walsingham and the lawyers argued with her in her chambers. They threatened her. They told her that if she didn't show up, they would try her in absentia, and she would have no voice to defend her honor. Finally, Mary relented, but she made it clear. She was attending not as a criminal defendant, but as a woman defending her reputation against slander. The scene in the great hall of Fotheringhay was theatrical and intimidating. At one end of the room stood an empty chair of state, symbolizing the absent Queen Elizabeth. The commissioners sat on benches lining the walls. In the center sat Mary. She was 43 years old, crippled by severe rheumatism, and her once legendary beauty had faded into a stark, dignified gravity. She was dressed in black velvet. She had no lawyer. She had no notes. She was not allowed to see the evidence against her. She was one woman against the 36 sharpest legal minds in England. And yet she fought like a lioness. The trial was a brutal interrogation. The Crown lawyers, led by Sir Edward Coke, hammered her with the Babington letters. They read out the fatal passages, the plans for invasion, the plans for rescue, and the agreement to the tragical execution of Elizabeth. Mary's defense was masterful. She admitted to plotting her escape. "Is it a crime for a captive to seek freedom?" she asked. She admitted to corresponding with foreign powers, but she vehemently, passionately denied plotting the assassination. "I have never thought, nor wished, nor devised the death of my sister the Queen," she declared. "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than have one drop of her blood shed." Then came the turning point. The prosecution produced the confessions of her secretaries and the copies of the letters deciphered by Felipe's. Mary attacked the evidence itself. She demanded to see the original letters in her own handwriting. But of course, the originals had been sent to Babington and destroyed. All the court had were Felipe's copies. Mary spotted the trap immediately. She argued that ciphers could be forged. She argued that Walsingham, whom she looked dead in the eye and accused of engineering her destruction, could have altered the text. "How do I know," she asked, "that your cipher master has not inserted things I never wrote?" She was exactly right. We know today that Felipe's did forge the postscript asking for the names of the assassins. Mary's intuition was flawless, but she couldn't prove it. The most dramatic moment came when she turned to Walsingham. Tears of frustration in her eyes, she said, "You have practiced against my life and against my son's. I am a queen, not a subject. You are murdering me with ink." Walsingham stood up, his black robes rustling, and swore on his soul that he had done nothing but his duty as a private man and a public servant. It was a lie, but it was a lie told by the winner. The trial at Fotheringhay ended without a verdict being announced on the spot, a calculated move to maintain a veneer of deliberation. The commissioners packed up and returned to London. On October 25th, they reconvened in the Star Chamber at Westminster. This time the verdict was swift and unanimous. Mary Stuart was found guilty of being privy to and imagining the death of the Queen's Majesty. Parliament met shortly after, and petitioned Elizabeth to execute the sentence immediately. Their argument was brutal in its logic. As long as the Scottish queen lives, the English queen is in danger. They called Mary the monstrous and huge dragon and the daughter of sedition. The legal machinery was done. Babington's foolish letter had done its work. The death warrant was drawn up. All it needed was Elizabeth's signature. History often remembers Elizabeth I as decisive, but in the winter of 1586, she was paralyzed by indecision. Executing Mary wasn't just about killing a rival, it was about breaking a divine taboo. Kings and queens were God's anointed. If Elizabeth executed a fellow queen, she was setting a terrifying precedent. She was telling the world that a monarch's head could be cut off. In less than 70 years, her own successor's son, Charles I, would lose his head to the same logic. Elizabeth stalled. She raged at her ministers. She sat in dark rooms, muttering to herself in Latin, out feri. She tried to find another way. In a moment of dark desperation, she even hinted to Mary's jailer, Amyas Paulet, that it would be very convenient if Mary were to simply die of natural causes, or perhaps an accident. She was asking for a covert assassination to save her the public shame of an execution. Paulet, a strict Puritan with a rigid code of honor, was horrified. He refused to turn his castle into a murder pit. He replied that he would not make shipwreck of my conscience. Elizabeth was furious. She was cornered. She had to do it legally or not at all. On February 1st, 1587, the tension broke. Elizabeth called for her secretary, William Davison. She asked for the piles of state papers waiting for her signature. Buried in the stack was the death warrant for Mary, Queen of Scots. In a scene that Davison later recounted with trembling fear, the Queen signed the warrant quickly, almost casually, amidst other routine documents. She dropped it on the floor. Then she looked up at Davison with a dark, sardonic joke. She told him to take the signed warrant to the Lord Chancellor to be sealed with the Great Seal of England, but added, "Do not tell Walsingham yet, for I fear the shock of it will kill him outright." It was a grim jest about her spy master's obsession with Mary's death. But then the waters muddied. Elizabeth claimed later that she had signed it only for safety, to be used if a foreign army landed. She claimed she never commanded it to be sent. Her counselors, led by Lord Burghley and Walsingham, didn't wait to find out. They knew the Queen's habit of changing her mind. The moment they had the signed document with the Great Seal, they held a secret meeting. They decided to dispatch the warrant immediately without telling the Queen. They would carry this in so she could claim innocence. The arrival of Robert Beale at Fotheringhay Castle shattered the stalemate. The ink on the parchment was dry, the Great Seal was affixed, and the legal arguments were silenced. There were no more moves to make, no more letters to smuggle, and no more spies to outwit. As the winter sun set on February 7th, the political machinery stopped and the human tragedy took center stage. The castle grew quiet save for the sounds of hammers in the great hall constructing the stage for the morning's grim ritual. Upstairs, Mary Stuart listened to the sounds of her own scaffold being built. She understood that the time for plotting was over. The time for dying well had begun. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the narrative arc that Babington had so clumsily started prepared to close with a dignity he had never managed to achieve. On the night of February 3rd, 1587, a gentleman named Robert Beale, the clerk of the council, and a man known for his harsh anti-Catholic views, rode out of London. In his saddlebag he carried a piece of parchment. It was the physical manifestation of Anthony Babington's failure. Beale rode hard. The journey to Fotheringhay took days in the winter mud. He arrived at the castle on Sunday, February 5th. He conferred with the executioners. He conferred with the jailers. They needed time to build the scaffold in the great hall. They needed to make sure everything was ready. On the afternoon of Tuesday, February 7th, the castle grew quiet. Beale and the Earl of Shrewsbury climbed the stairs to Mary's chambers. They entered. Mary was in bed, unwell. They told her to prepare herself. Beale unrolled the parchment. He read the commission. It stated that for the safety of the realm and the person of Queen Elizabeth, Mary Stuart was to die the next morning at 8 a.m. Mary listened without a flicker of fear. When they finished, she crossed herself. She thanked God that her pilgrimage was finally at an end. She asked only for her priest. The men left. The door was locked. Anthony Babington had been dead for 5 months. His body had rotted, but the clock he had started was now ticking down its final 12 hours. Inside the chamber, the Queen of Scots began to prepare her final outfit. She knew that tomorrow she would not just be dying, she would be performing. She intended to die a Catholic martyr, and she intended to wear red. On the night of Tuesday, February 7th, 1587, Mary Stuart did not sleep. She spent her final hours meticulously curating her own legend. She knew that the manner of her death would define how history remembered her. If she died weeping and begging, she would be remembered as a guilty criminal. If she died with courage and piety, she would be remembered as a Catholic martyr, a victim of Protestant tyranny. She sat at her desk and wrote her final will. She divided her meager belongings, her rosaries, her silver, her clothes, among her servants. She carefully washed the feet of her ladies-in-waiting, mimicking Christ at the Last Supper, and asked them to forgive her for any harsh words she might have spoken. She then spent the rest of the night in prayer. At 2 a.m. she laid down on her bed, but she did not sleep. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the dawn. At 8 a.m. on Wednesday, February 8th, the sheriff of Northampton knocked on her door. Mary rose. She was physically frail, crippled by rheumatism, and could barely walk. 2 of her servants had to support her by the elbows, but her head was high. She descended the great staircase of Fotheringhay. At the bottom, she was met by the Earl of Shrewsbury and the Earl of Kent. The procession entered the great hall. It was packed with about 300 spectators, local gentry, castle staff, and officials. In the center of the room stood the scaffold. It was 2 feet high, draped in black cloth. On it stood a low wooden block, a cushion, and the executioner, a man named Bull, and his assistant. Both were masked. Mary looked at the axe. She did not flinch. She climbed the steps to the scaffold with difficulty, but refused help from the executioners. The warrant for execution was read aloud. It was long and legalistic. Mary seemed not to listen. She sat with a small smile on her face, as if she were thinking of something else entirely. When the reading was finished, the Protestant Dean of Peterborough, Dr. Fletcher, stepped forward. He began to lecture her, urging her to repent of her popish sins and embrace the true Protestant faith before she met her Maker. Mary cut him off. "Mr. Dean," she said firmly, "I am settled in the ancient Catholic Roman religion, and mind to spend my blood in defense of it." The dean persisted. Mary turned her back on him. She began to pray aloud in Latin. The dean began to pray loudly in English, trying to drown her out. It was a bizarre, chaotic duel of prayers on the edge of the grave. Then came the moment of supreme theater. The executioners stepped forward to help her undress. It was customary for the condemned to remove their outer garments so the neck would be bare. Mary's ladies-in-waiting stepped in to help her, weeping uncontrollably. Mary gently chided them. "Do not cry. I have promised for you." She removed her black outer gown. She removed her veil. Underneath, the room gasped. Mary was wearing a bodice and petticoat of deep crimson velvet. In the liturgical symbolism of the Catholic Church, red is the color of martyrdom, the color of blood shed for the faith. She had planned this. She stood against the black backdrop of the scaffold, a brilliant, defiant flame of red. She was visually declaring her victory. She wasn't being executed for treason. She was dying for her church. Her eyes were bound with a white cloth embroidered in gold. She knelt on the cushion. She began to recite the psalm, Inte Domine speravi. She laid her head on the block. It was a low block requiring her to lie almost flat. She stretched out her neck. Her last words were, Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. The hall went silent. The executioner bull raised the axe. Perhaps he was nervous. Perhaps he was distracted by the weeping of the women or the pressure of killing a queen. He swung. It was a disaster. The axe missed the neck. It struck the back of Mary's head, biting deep into the skull but not killing her. A gasp of horror went through the room. Mary reportedly made a small guttural sound. The executioner panicked. He wrenched the axe free and swung again. This second blow severed the neck, but not completely. A piece of sinew and skin still held the head to the body. The executioner threw down the axe and used a knife to saw through the final piece of flesh. The head fell. The executioner reached down to grab it by the hair and hold it up to the crowd, as was the custom, shouting, God save the Queen. But Mary Stuart had one last tragic reveal. When the executioner grabbed the head did not come up with it. The hair came away in his hand. It was a wig. Mary's real hair had been cut short and was stark gray. The head rolled onto the scaffold floor. The illusion of the ageless queen was shattered in the cruelest way possible. The spectators stared not at a beauty, but at the face of an old, tired woman who had suffered immensely. Eyewitnesses noted with a shudder that for nearly 15 minutes after the death, the lips of the severed head continued to move, as if still trying to finish her prayer. But the most heartbreaking detail was discovered when the executioners went to strip the body. Hiding underneath Mary's red petticoats, terrified and shaking, was a small Skye Terrier dog. The little dog had snuck onto the scaffold with her. It was soaked in her blood. It refused to leave the body. It snapped and growled at the executioners when they tried to move it. Eventually, it had to be forcibly removed and washed, but it reportedly refused to eat and died of grief shortly after. When the news of the execution reached London, the bells rang again, but at the palace there was no celebration. Queen Elizabeth flew into a terrifying rage. She claimed she had never meant for the warrant to be sent. She screamed at her counselors. She threw William Davison, the secretary who had handed over the warrant, into the Tower of London and ruined his life. Whether her grief was genuine or a political act is debated to this day, but the deed was done. The threat was gone. And what of Anthony Babington? As the years passed, the Babington plot became a staple of history books, but Babington himself faded into a caricature. He is not remembered as a villain of grand stature like Guy Fawkes or Macbeth. He is remembered as a warning against vanity. He was the wealthy boy who thought life was a romance novel. He thought he could write himself into history as a hero. He did write himself into history, but as the useful idiot. His legacy is one of supreme irony. He wanted to save Mary. He killed her. He wanted to destroy Elizabeth. He made her secure. He wanted to restore Catholicism. He hardened the English hatred of it for centuries. He wanted to be a leader. He proved to be the perfect puppet. In the end, Anthony Babington's life serves as a brutal lesson in the difference between the fantasy of revolution and the cold, hard reality of statecraft. He played a game he didn't understand against masters who had invented the rules, and the price of his admission was the blood of a queen.